Well, for more on the situation in China, we can speak to Drew Thompson, visiting senior research fellow at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore and former U.S. Department of Defense official responsible for China. He's currently in Taipei. Great to get you on the program. I just want to get your thoughts in the first instance. You know, we saw some remarkable scenes there in my colleague Stephen's report. Do you think these protests will continue? And how do you think we're going to see a sort of response from authorities? We've already heard of strong police presence out there.
Well, certainly, I think we'll be able to see these protests ebb and flow. What's interesting is they've been geographically distributed throughout China. They've involved very different classes of people, from students to workers in places like Zhengzhou and Guangdong, migrant workers. It's included middle-class people as well as students. So it's fairly geographically and socially spread, but there doesn't appear to be any sort of guiding hand. There doesn't appear to be a leadership. These people aren't being instigated. This is a reflection of widespread discontent with the situation they're in, which is, being forced to be locked in their homes, losing income, and facing really economic headwinds. So I think the protests will continue, and they're likely to ebb and flow because they're not being called out into the streets in a controlled fashion. So the police, of course, has tremendous capacity. China spends more money on internal security than it does on its People's Liberation Army, which also has an internal security role. So I think the ability of China to control these protests going forward, even as they ebb and flow and they move between social media and the street, the ability to tamp that down is quite high. And I'm sure that the police is out in force, but at the same time, you probably have the People's Armed Police mobilizing in every province, preparing to deal with wide-scale unrest that can't be handled by the police itself. And behind the People's Armed Police, you have the PLA providing their support as well.
Yeah, Drew, there's been a lot said, of course, about the fact that protesters have called for Xi Jinping to be held to account over the COVID policy. How much of a threat do you think these protests will be for him personally?
I don't think these are threats. I mean, China is not governed that way. It's a very interesting juxtaposition to be here in Taipei for the elections this weekend and to see the transfer of power at local levels take place in a very peaceful and constructive way. It's not how power is garnered in China. The ability to control the population, whether that's online or in the street, is actually probably more important for Xi Jinping's legitimacy. I mean, one of the factors here, of course, is the COVID response and the inability of the government to open up the society to expose them to the virus. Because if it were to spread throughout the population, it would overwhelm the healthcare system, and that would be an even greater legitimacy crisis for the government and the party than these basically undirected street protests.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, with the images of these protests all being flashed all over the world, I wonder what you make of the level of dissent within China itself, because as you've pointed out, they're widespread, but they are in sort of major cities, aren't they?
Yeah, but I think if you also look at the rate of urbanization, more than 65% of the population now lives in cities. If you go back to the 1980s, it was half that. I think also, if you think about the rise of the middle class, around 2000, you had maybe 40 million people considered to be middle class people. Today, it's over 700 million. So you've got urbanization, middle class people now living in apartments in cities. And that's one of the reasons I think the Urumqi fire in the apartment and the inability of people to escape the fire because of COVID literally locks on doors. I think that hits home, and that affects everybody. Potentially, that could be anybody in China now. And that's one of the reasons there's not just frustration, but I think a degree of fear as well. So it's not just fear of the virus, but fear of the consequences of zero COVID.
Fascinating stuff. Drew Thompson, visiting senior research fellow at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. Thank you so much for joining us on Newsday.
My pleasure.